Jeremy's War, Chapter 18. I ran out of the barracks at the same moment Brock appeared from the officers' quarters. He sprinted across the parade ground toward the stables. I was there before him. "Where's the saddle?" "Here, sir." He didn't wait for me to help, but threw the saddle over Alfred's back and cinched it tight. I was saddling the horse beside. "Tell the other officers I'm on my way to Queenston." I looked up at him. "Sir, let me go with you. My horse is ready." "I don't need you at Queenston." He wheeled Alfred toward the stable door. "You do, sir. You need a messenger. I'm the only one ready." He paused for a second, then waved me onto my horse. "Follow me." We rode through the gates of Fort George together, then turned south toward the artillery that roared 5 miles away. It was still dark, and a cold sleet cut at our clothes. Brock's cloak was quickly spattered with mud. I was covered in it, but he ignored the sleet and the mud and pushed Alfred on. I watched him, bent over his horse, staring out at the night. It was up to him now. He knew it. We all knew it. Our lives, our future, were up to him. I suddenly realized how lonely he must be, riding in the dark toward battle. I felt glad I was there with him. A rider came charging down the road toward us. Brock raised his hand and the rider reined in his horse, though he was going so fast he almost got past us before he could stop. He was a young militia officer. "Sir," he was breathless, "the Americans have landed in force at Queenston." "How many? Are they being opposed?" Brock leaned forward in his saddle. "Yes, sir," the officer said excitedly. "Our cannon on the heights are doing great damage. Their boats are sinking or being forced downstream. Only a few hundred troops have made it to our side, and we have them pinned." "Good," Brock replied. "Get to Fort George. Tell General Sheaffe to stand ready. This may be only a diversion." "Yes, sir." The officer saluted, and we rode off in our different directions. We were almost at Queenston when we came upon a company of militia marching toward the village. They were the York militia, the same men who had volunteered to follow Brock to Detroit. Now they were with him here. The general took off his hat and waved them toward the village. They gave him a cheer in reply. The eastern sky was streaked red with approaching dawn when we reached the village. Queenston was a collection of about a dozen houses surrounded by orchards and old stone fences. The village was already crowded with more than 100 soldiers from the 49th Regiment. They were Brock's favorite. He'd been with them for years and had brought them down from Kingston for the battle. They shouted and cheered as he rode past them. Brock pushed Alfred up the slope from the village to the heights that overlooked the river. He ignored the steady stream of cannon fire that poured across the American side, onto the slope and into the village. Even before we reached the crest, the sound of the battle had become deafening. When we got to the top, we saw why. The American artillery was positioned directly across from us on the American heights. Volley after volley of grape shot poured across the sky. The American village of Lewiston was choked with regiments of American troops. Below us, a handful of our militia were pouring a deadly fire on several hundred Yankees who huddled defenseless at the bottom of the cliff. Our own cannon was sending shot at the wide, flat boats that every now and then launched from the American shore and tried to cross the river. The gorge below us was filled with smoke and fog and dying men. The rising sun showed bodies floating face down in the swirling waters of the Niagara. Downstream, American soldiers struggled onto shore, some in the remains of their shattered boats, some swimming for their lives. They were quickly taken prisoner. It was an inferno in the gorge. To the Americans trapped under our fire, it must have been like hell itself. Brock dismounted and led Alfred down a steep slope to our cannon. From our militia below, an officer came scrambling up the slope to meet him. "General Brock, Captain Dennis at your service, sir." He saluted, but couldn't keep a grin off his face. "I think we have them, sir." Brock shook his head, puzzled. "What's the matter with them? They have thousands of men over there, but they just sit. Why don't they cross?" "Lack of boats, I think." Dennis had to shout to make himself heard over the roar of the cannon. "And they may not want to cross after seeing what happened to the first wave." Brock gazed down on the Americans huddled at the base of the cliff. Most of them were wounded, crouched among their own dead, using them for shelter. I had never seen dead and wounded soldiers before. The sight of it made my head go light. I stepped back, afraid I might be sick. Brock was unmoved. He was used to battlefields. "Dennis," he said, pointing. Is there any way those men can scale these cliffs and come at us from behind? Dennis shook his head. No, sir. There's only one path from the landing to the village, and we have it covered. There's no path straight up the cliff. Good. Brock waved to a company of infantry that had appeared at the crest of the heights above the cannon. An officer hurried forward. Send word to Fort George and to Chippewa in the south. Brock's voice was calm, almost quiet. Tell them to send reinforcements. He looked out at the thousands of Americans on the far shore. Evans was right. This is no diversion. This is the main attack. He turned back to the officer. Take your men down the cliff to where the militia are stationed and support their fire on their troops, landing at the dock. Yes, sir. The officer saluted and hurried off. Brock turned his attention to the cannon beside us. Some of the shells were falling short. He started giving orders on how to improve the range. I never saw them. Brock never saw them. They came from nowhere. Not nowhere. They came along a path that wound up the cliff, the path that everyone had said didn't exist, except the Americans knew it did. We heard a shout, and then a ragged cheer behind us. Brock wheeled around. Maybe 60 Americans were rushing toward us from the top of the crest above. In the pale morning light, their bayonets glowed dull and deadly. Spike the cannon, Brock shouted. If the Americans got the use of our artillery, they could pour shot down on our troops directly below. A young gunner shoved a metal spike into the cannon's powder hole. Now the cannon was useless. Follow me! Brock grabbed Alfred's reins and led the gun crew away from the cannon. In a moment we were scrambling down the hill toward the village. A roar went up from the other side of the river. The Americans had seen their own troops on the heights. The battle had turned. We fell back to the village, but the American cannon from across the river rained shot down on the houses more fiercely than ever. The balls crashed through the shingled roofs, set fires, burning, smashed stone. The few civilians who hadn't fled cowered in their root cellars. Dust and smoke surrounded everything. Dennis, the militia captain, was wounded, so were many of his men. Brock pulled the troops, maybe 200 of us now, back to the far edge of the village. We huddled there under the American cannon fire, watching as more and more Yankee soldiers appeared at the crest of the heights to reinforce the men already there. A moment ago, the battle was ours. The Americans pinned down, trapped, most of them afraid even to cross the river. Now they were in command. They owned the heights and had us pinned in the village. Brock was losing the battle. I crouched behind a stone fence, terrified. I'd never been under fire before. Every cannon shot stabbed at my nerves. I wanted to flatten myself against the stone until I became part of it. I wanted to be away from here, anywhere but in the middle of this deadly fire. I had followed Brock to Queenston because it was my duty, but mostly because I wanted to watch Brock win. But this was not Detroit. The Yankees had us. He was only a few feet from me, behaving the same as he ever did. He ignored the grape shot that whistled about him. His face was calm, his voice steady, except I noticed he was clenching and unclenching his left fist over and over, which I'd never seen him do before. Dennis crawled up beside Brock. He was bleeding in the leg and shoulder, his face ashen. Sir, he gasped, are reinforcements coming? Brock nodded. They're coming, but they'll be too late. The Americans grow stronger each minute. We must counterattack. Dennis's jaw dropped. Sir, we have barely 200 men. We've lost our cannon. They have the high ground. An attack will fail. Brock shook his head. Not if pressed forward with determination. He looked toward the heights. If the Americans control the heights, they control the village. They will be able to move their entire army across. They will winter here, growing stronger each week. By the time spring comes, it will be impossible to defeat them. If we do not win the heights back now, we will have lost the war. Dennis nodded. He seemed unconvinced, but Brock was the general, and Dennis had already been wrong about the path up the cliff. Brock walked swiftly over to a nearby house. I had tethered Alfred there, behind the far wall for safety. Suddenly, he appeared in front of us, mounted on Alfred, the cannon whistling past. "Follow me, boys!" he shouted. "Follow me! We shall defeat them yet!" He shook Alfred's reins, and the two of them moved gravely forward. The men looked at each other, and some groaned, but they rose from behind their shelters and fell into formation behind him. I didn't want to leave the safety of the fence. I didn't want to stand before their cannon and muskets and die. But Brock was at the front. How could I cower here while he marched off toward the enemy? What would he think of me? I looked along the fence. A militiaman sprawled dead on the ground, a mass of red flesh where his face had been. My stomach heaved, and I choked and swallowed hard. He had a musket, and I needed a musket. I crawled along the fence toward him, grabbed the musket, pulled the canvas satchel of balls and powder from around his neck, wiped off the blood, and ran toward the troops ahead. At the base of the slope rising up to the crest of the heights was a stone fence. Brock had already dismounted and was crouching behind it. The men filed in along either side, and the bush above the Yankee infantry kept a steady fire over our heads. Brock looked at the soldiers and militia huddled together. "Take a breath, boys," he called out. "You'll need it in a moment." A ragged cheer ran down the line. I crouched a few feet away from Brock, my musket clenched in my shaking hands. Suddenly, Brock was beside me, prying the musket away. "Batmen don't fight," he said quietly. "Who would press my uniform if you were shot? Stay with Alfred." "Please, sir," I swallowed. "I need to be here." He paused for a moment, looked at me, then handed back the musket and rested his hand lightly on my shoulder. "Good luck, son." I tried to grin. "Good luck, General." He tried to grin back. "Good luck to us both." Then he stood, pulled his sword from his sheath, and pointed it toward the hill. "Forward!" In an instant, he was over the fence, striding up the slope. We scrambled over the fence behind him, trying to catch up. There was no time to form a proper line. We fanned out behind Brock, marching up the steep slope of the hill toward the crest. The ground was slick with wet leaves. It was hard to keep our footing. Ahead of us at the top of the hill, the Americans clustered around the captured cannon. Others crouched in nearby bushes. Both kept up a steady fire. A man groaned and fell beside me. Another, directly ahead, clutched his side and fell to the ground. I stepped over him, tried not to think, tried to push back the fear. But we were getting closer. Our line held behind Brock. I saw blood trickling from his hand. He'd been nicked there by a musket ball. But he ignored the wound and pushed forward, his saber drawn, calling to the men to follow. The Americans fell back to the edge of the cliff. They hadn't expected a frontal attack. They were frightened by the determined troops who slipped and stumbled up the hill toward them, ignoring their fire. I saw someone pull out a white handkerchief and begin to wave it. An officer struck it down with a curse, pulled out his sword and pointed it toward us. The Americans charged. We didn't expect it. Their commander had the same blood in his veins as Brock did. He had his back to a cliff, nowhere to go, so he charged. They fired as they marched down the hill toward us. Men fell. The troops behind Brock turned their backs on the Yankees, began to retreat down the hill. Brock swiveled around, saw his men falling back, and cried out, "Not the 49th! The 49th never turns its back!" The men hesitated, unsure. The Americans were advancing. Men were dying everywhere, but Brock was there, calling them to follow. Brock, who the men who had never disobeyed, who had given them victory, who they loved in a way, the way soldiers love a general they trust. The men looked at each other. Should they die for him? For an instant the sun came out. Gold glinted off the wet leaves and grass. I looked up the hill. Brock was maybe 3 steps away, his sword drawn, calling out to the wavering British line. "Forward, men!" he shouted to us. "Forward!" The sun gleamed off his epaulets, glowed off the silver blade of his sword. For a moment everything seemed suspended, the battle hanging in the air like the smoke from our muskets. I saw the Yankee soldier kneeling, saw him sight down his barrel, saw the flash and puff of smoke. Brock stopped in mid-stride. His sword fell from his hand. I watched it fall. It seemed forever. Onto the wet grass below. He sank to his knees, then pitched forward, his face buried in the glistening leaves. "No!" I stumbled forward, fell, pushed myself on, reached him, got my hands on his shoulders, rolled him over. His face was lifeless. A red stain spread across his scarlet tunic, darkening it to blood red. Brock was dead.